I already know, just based on the title of this video, that there's going to be some heated debates in the comments disagreeing with me or other commenters. There's almost no way around that. But before we get into the meat of the content, let me explain what I mean. The episodes on the list are ranked in terms of how much the fan consensus differs with my own opinion. Meaning the more fans like something and I dislike it, the higher it'll be on this list. I already know I'm going to be tearing apart some fan favorites, that's just part of it. But just keep in mind that this is my opinion, which should go without saying, but I have been getting some comments that seem to not know the difference between fact and opinion, and it gets to the point that I'm concerned, so without further ado, here's the list. I'm gonna level with you. I don't see many people put this episode on their favorites list, and to be fair, just because an episode is on this list, it doesn't mean I hate it. It just means that the love the episode gets is more than it deserves in my opinion. And in my opinion, I don't really hear many people talk about how flawed this episode is. It's still good, don't get me wrong, but I think it has some problems. For one, whenever this episode used to air, and this is true for at least a few Season 2 episodes, the colors would especially be muted, and it was very noticeable here. But beyond that minor production flub, the episode kind of drags in the beginning before we get to SpongeBob's hallucinations, and even still then, some parts were funny, whereas some kind of drag. I don't find the mailman joke to be very funny, and some parts where SpongeBob writes the essay actually were pretty funny. I like the joke, but I have a problem with the story escalation. It's probably my biggest problem with the episode. It's not very gradual, and what sucks about that is that they removed a scene that could have developed SpongeBob's feelings even more, showing everyone having fun outside. SpongeBob then only writes most of his essay right before he has to go back to class, and at the end of the episode, we find that it was all basically for nothing. Is this episode really an example of Season 2 at its best? Or, for that matter, is this episode even in the top half of Season 2? I don't think so. The more and more we look back at the middle seasons, the more they actually look better in comparison to the more recent ones. Don't get me wrong, Season 7 is still bad, but it's far from the worst the show has to offer. This episode is still considered by most fans to be a pretty good time travel story and a nice attempt at a different style for SpongeBob. The problem is we already had a time travel story in SB129, and we already had plenty of episodes where villains had their victories. That doesn't make it bad if an episode tries to do those things again, but to me, while still good, this episode isn't even that close to being one of my favorites of Season 7. But what surprises me is that for a lot of people it is, even when we have episodes like Enchanted Tiki Dreams and Earworm. In general, if you're watching SpongeBob all the way through, Season 7 is probably a skip. So if you're gonna watch something from that season or hold it up as some kind of really good episode, it had better be a masterpiece. And no, not the masterpiece. You know, in this video, it's probably going to look like I'm giving the first 3 seasons a lot of hate, but again, remember, I don't really hate any of these episodes, I just think the love they get is a bit too much, thus their placement on this list. I just want to get that out of the way because the next entry on this list is Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 3. And in fact, Back to the Past is the only episode outside the first 3 seasons on this list. But back to the actual number 3 entry. This episode is one I constantly see getting quoted and memed, and honestly, looking back at the episode, all it is a couple of funny moments and pretty much a story that drags. I mean, most of it takes place in a cave, which is not a very interesting locale, and Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy don't even really appear past the first part of the episode, so it doesn't really feel like a Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode. And of the ones that were numbered, this feels like the weakest one to me. Yes, I know the wallet scene came from this episode, and yeah, that's a great scene, but the rest of the episode is kind of slow compared to the rest of Season 2 and the rest of the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes. Speaking of Season 2... Okay, here's where we definitively start pissing people off. Entries 5 through 3 were viewed as good episodes, maybe even great by the fanbase, but now I think we've entered the territory of legitimately a lot of people's favorite episodes. So yes, I think Patty Hype is overrated. Obviously it's not that bad, but the way this episode begins is one of the weirder beginnings in the first 3 seasons. I mean, first off, this episode starts off drab and gray, which is a way we haven't really seen the Krusty Krab before or since. But there's also the serious tone, which just kind of lingers through the episode. It's not a terrible design choice, but it's not one that I'd expect from SpongeBob, even with a lot of good jokes sprinkled in. For whatever reason, this episode in my mind occupies a space for melancholic things. It's one of the least upbeat tones in the first 3 seasons, let alone the entire show, and I don't know why, because it really does try and succeed at having its good and funny moments. It's just one of those weird anomalies. This really was one of the higher regarded episodes in Season 2, but in my opinion, it just doesn't measure up to the best of them, because I believe that a lot of Season 2 episodes are much better. Obviously, I knew that number 1 was going to be saved for the most controversial pick, as that's literally the way I decided to rank this list. Even in so doing, I expect most people to still recoil in horror at what I've decided to pick. This episode's a classic. It's one that many people consider one of their favorites, and of course, it is from one of the 3 classic seasons.
Get over it!
Okay, fine. Ripped Pants. Yes, aside from the song really, this is one of the SpongeBob episodes that I like, but don't really see the love for. And yes, the song is really good, and is probably the best part of the episode. I'm not going to act like it's not. It's one of those that not only sounds really good, but also ties a nice bow on the episode. But there is one problem. The episode does drag at points, and while you don't have to consistently keep telling jokes to make me happy, I do think there is a lesser quantity of really good ones here than they usually are in Season 1. Obviously, this was one of the first few episodes of the show, so they were still kind of figuring things out, but it still isn't best of the show material in my mind. If you want some laughs from Season 1, you can still find them in almost any episode that season, but there are better places to look. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering about any kind of honorable mentions, Chocolate with Nuts was going to be number 6. Oh no.